So as Jeff was reading that for us, what I want to emphasize from that is that Jesus became like his brothers, talking about human beings, in every respect. He was a human. He needed the same things that we needed. We can look to him as an example of different things that we need. And that should be a focus for us today. But I want to ask you a question. How many people do you know? And as you start filing through some of the different names and faces, and you're thinking about those relationships, I want you to start thinking about the relationships that are closest to you and most important. You have family or spouses or best friends that are coming to mind. Tonight we're going to talk about something I think that is extremely practical. I would like to think this morning was practical, but it was a little more theological. But tonight we're going to talk about something very practical, I think, and that is we're going to look at Jesus' social circles. Maybe you've never thought of that before. And I don't really know how else to put it, but then that. If you've never thought about it, we can see how Jesus organized his relationships. And when you look at how Jesus organized his relationships, it's really actually very thought-provoking. For one, because he was very intentional about it. For example, he picked the 12 apostles out of his disciples. And he had different relationships among them. And this is something that we can understand, obviously, as Jesus being who he is, we can understand that he is providing us a healthy model for relationships. And that it's something that we should try to emulate in our own lives. So as we look at Jesus' circles of relationships and try to view them as a model, I want to admit that I don't totally understand the reasons for this. Why he did it the way that he did, or maybe if I just blindly take and copy and paste what he did, what the benefit is for me, but I still recognize this model in Scripture. And we're talking about this because I need it. It first piqued my interest because I heard someone mention this concept, and then as I was reflecting on it, I saw how poor my own life was structured in this. And in fact, in the car on the way home this morning, Salem and I were talking about the lesson tonight, and she kind of gave me an elbow when I said something, and she said that was you to think about, that you need some work on that. She didn't say it exactly like that, but that was the gist. You know, relationships can be hard. I think we all know that. And I am actually an extremely introverted person. If you see me in other aspects of life, I'm probably not talking. And I have my own personal issues. And so I'm not great at relationships. And many of us can understand, or maybe you can sympathize with me that making friends is not always easy. And that I haven't always been the best about investing in my relationships. I think we can all maybe think about that in our own lives. But Jesus gives us a very helpful picture, an ideal picture, or a guidance, depending on how you want to say that. And tonight then we're going to look at some representative points from Jesus' life about his relationships. We'll consider them and then we'll apply them. And so as we look at this, the first thing that we notice is that Jesus belonged to a community, and that was the disciples. So sometimes the word disciples, of course, refers to the 12 or the apostles specifically, but other times it refers to the larger group of people that were following around, which included some of the women who seemed to have supported him financially in some respects, and other people that weren't included in the apostles. Jesus had a larger community that he was primarily associated with. You might think of even just his local synagogue where he grew up. But for instance, Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 15 in verse 6 that over 500 people witnessed the resurrected Jesus. Now, of course, we don't know everybody there, and I don't think everybody in that group was a believer beforehand. I think James, the brother of Jesus, is an example of that. He doesn't seem to have been a believer until he encounters the resurrected Jesus. But Paul is mentioning these 500 people who are witnesses, this community. And when we think about it, really, Jesus created his own community based on his unique identity, and then calling these people to himself based on that identity of being the Messiah. But when we think about it, communities are where we find identity and belonging. Humans look for a sense of where we belong and who we are based on the primary groups that we belong to. And so as an exercise for all of us, if you ask yourself in your head right now, who am I? And what are the first few words that pop up? Those first few answers to your question of who am I that are at the top is going to reveal what you believe is your identity. For each of us, I would say that our identity as a disciple of Jesus needs to be at the top. Depending on how you think about it, of course, you might say that my primary identity is that I'm created in the image of God, and then I would understand if that's first. But that is what primarily defines who we are. So the community that we are a part of, that gives us part of our belonging, is that we are disciples of Jesus. And we understand in looking at communities that it's important to everyone to have a community that they belong to. Everybody is trying to be a part of something. And that's part of the problem that we see, the epidemic, especially among young people in our country and in other westernized countries, that because of alienation through social media and COVID epidemics and all of those things, that they are feeling as if they are unplugged from any kind of community. And it's wreaking all kinds of havoc on them in terms of mental health, emotional well-being, and so forth. But this is one of the reasons that being part of a local body of God's people is so important. That it gives us a sense of identity and belonging, and it tells us who we are. And this is just one of the primary aspects of community. So I'm going to step up then and say, we all need to work to see this church as one of, if not the, primary community that we belong to. And I say one of because I suspect that for many of us, our community of belonging with the disciples extends beyond these walls. And that's a byproduct of our modern time, where you have friends that are Christians probably that might be across the country or that live in Indianapolis or whatever, and you're able to communicate in that way. But we're here, and we all live in the same community. And so we need to realize the primacy of that and understand that this should be one of the things that we are working toward in understanding that we belong to. To follow the model of Jesus that we're looking at, we need to try and find a primary sense of belonging among God's family. And I hope that this immediate body is one of the biggest pieces of that. But if we continue to look on, and we look at this verse, and I realize that for some reason the reference is not on. This is Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, if you're looking at that. And I'm realizing that the template that I use is not going to put the references, so I will try to remember to say them out loud. But Mark chapter 3, verses 13 through 15, it says, "Now Jesus went up the mountain, and he called for those he wanted, and they came to him. And he appointed 12 so that they would be with him, and he could send them to preach and have authority to cast out demons." So what we have here, we have that Jesus is with his disciples, the larger community, and it says that at one point he calls specific ones that he wanted to himself, and they become the 12 apostles. This was a different group. So out of this larger community, Jesus picked 12 who would be his most trusted friends and helpers. And those are the names that we know, the apostles. This effectively was Jesus' group of friends. It extended a little bit beyond this, of course. But this is who he spent time with, who he ate with, who he worked with. And so for one thing, we see Jesus was part of community, but Jesus also maintained friendships. We see that in the 12. We move from community to friendships. And I wouldn't say that necessarily the specific number 12 is a requirement that we should try to replicate. Maybe it's good because there are some other significant aspects as to why there was 12 apostles. But we see that he maintained relationships with several people that gave him support. That it wasn't just one, and obviously you can't be close with 500 people, right? And so we see that he had a group of friends that he gained support from. And I know that especially as we get older, and I've even just experienced this with getting married and having kids, it's harder to make friends. And sometimes you lose them, whether they're moving away or they're passing. It's hard to maintain friendships, but I think that we see even in the life of Jesus that it is important. And we all understand with the background of how God created us that we are wired for social interaction. So let's just keep that as a baseline. But we see that friendship is important. For example, we know the benefits of some of the oldest people in our society and the differences of when they are active socially versus when they're not. Those who are not plugged in and active socially tend to die sooner. Those who are active and making friendships and being associated with people, they have better qualities of life. Or even, for example, the effects of the COVID pandemic that it had on a lot of us. And how did we feel when we weren't able to see our friends as much as we wanted? And how did we feel when we felt disconnected from some of those communities? We need to be intentional about cultivating relationships. And in particular, looking at this, we need to be intentional about cultivating friendships and maintaining those. We talked about the importance of doing that with each other in our adult class. And you know what? Not everyone here is going to be your best friend. And that's fine. That's one of the good things about the diversity in the body. Not everyone's personality is going to click great. I'm probably not the type of guy that some of you want to hang around all the time. And I understand that. But we still have to work at our relationships and love each other because we're family. So we might not all be super close friends, but we are still family. And as all of you know, you don't always like your family, but you still have to love them. And you all know the relatives that I'm talking about. You've got them. Our circle of friends are often going to include people outside of this group, right? That's a product of the world that we live in. That's one of the results of our modern period of communication. And you're going to know Christians elsewhere, and you're going to have friends probably that are not Christians. But again, we need to think about our primary sources of identity and belonging and support. And if none of those are rooted in God's family, then there's probably a problem. But the point is, we need people. I think that's one of the biggest lies that I told myself for a long time is I'm independent, I don't need anybody. And that didn't get me anywhere good. And really what it was is I didn't want to be vulnerable. I didn't want to cultivate relationships. I didn't want to put the effort into maintaining those. We have to be intentional about this. And we might need different numbers of people in different amounts. Some of us are wired a little bit differently. I know that Greg can be around people a lot longer than I can. I know that from living with him. Sometimes I need to step back and just recharge. I don't know if he ever needs that. Same with Zach. People are different, but we all need people nonetheless. That is how we are made. And if you keep looking at the life of Jesus, we see these first 2 points of community and friendships, but also Jesus didn't just have friends. He had close friends. So for example, this is Mark chapter 5 and verse 37. Mark chapter 5 verse 37, and this is the raising of Jairus' daughter is the context. It said, and he allowed no one to follow him, that's into the house, except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And if we look at Mark chapter 14, and this is in the Garden of Gethsemane, on the night when Jesus is going to be betrayed. Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 32, it says, and they went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. So he's dividing them now. And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. So he goes to the garden with the disciples, he leaves the rest of them, and he takes further into the garden Peter, James, and John. And so there were 3 out of the 12 that Jesus seemed to be the closest to. And I don't know if that's because he trusted them the most. I don't know if it was something as simple as they clicked the most. I don't know why. But this is a fact that we see in the life of Jesus. And we see that that means Jesus kept close friends, namely Peter, James, and John. And I don't know about you, but I always feel bad for Andrew. Because at the beginning, it's Peter and Andrew and James and John, and then at some point, he just gets chopped off. And I wonder if he felt left out. But even Jesus needed a few close relationships where he could find emotional support and companionship. If you look at these situations where Jesus is singling these 3 out, they were involved in critical moments of Jesus' life. So for example, important miracles like in Mark chapter 5, the raising of the dead girl. He left everybody else outside and he brought those 3 in. Or for example, in Mark chapter 9 in his transfiguration, who does he take? He takes Peter, James, and John. And in his lamenting in Gethsemane, he leaves the rest of the disciples and he takes with him Peter, James, and John. There's a pattern there. And the pattern points to that these were the inner circle, as it's sometimes called, in the apostles. These were the ones that were the closest to Jesus. And so we can see from Jesus' example that we need to have a few people that we can really trust and that we can confess to and that we can receive the support that we need. And that's how Jesus seemed to have used these. And so I think it's a helpful exercise for each of us to ask with this point, who are my 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever it is? Who are the few people, the closest relationships that I know that I can depend on, that I can get this emotional support that I need? Who can I really count on? And I want you to be able to come up with answers to that. And if the answer is I don't have them, then you know where you need to work. This is an example from Jesus' life that we need these close relationships. And as we continue on with the next principle, this phrase might be a little more familiar to some of the younger people here, but have you ever heard the phrase, you're my person? Yeah, I see the younger people nodding their heads. I don't know if that has been said in times before, but people will often say, you're my person. That's my person. And I want to propose the possibility that Jesus had a person too. You could put a maybe next to this, but we could say that Jesus possibly had a best friend. That sounds weird. But I think that might be what is meant in one instance by the disciple whom Jesus loved. So you could possibly put a maybe in parentheses next to this, I understand. But it seems that Jesus had a best friend, at least as John's gospel expresses it. We have the 12 and we have the 3, and then there was another one that was singled out who was even closer. And usually this is said to be the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, but it's never explicitly identified who this person is. That's who we usually think it is. But regardless, this was a singular, important person who had some kind of special relationship to Jesus that the rest of them did not have. And so some examples of this. In John chapter 13, 23 through 25, this is, I believe, the first instance that we hear this phrase about this person, but it says, one of his disciples whom Jesus loved was reclining at table at Jesus' side. And so Simon Peter motioned him to ask Jesus of whom he was speaking, and that is who was going to betray him. So the disciple, leaning back against Jesus, said to him, "Lord, who is it?" This is a really intimate picture if you think about it. You know, they didn't have chairs, and so they would kind of recline on their sides around these tables. And this disciple was sitting next to Jesus and perhaps leaning on him, and Peter knew this guy won't be able to get it out of him. So he says, ask Jesus who this is, because you're the one that's going to be able to find out. And another example of this is that this man was to take care of Mary after Jesus' death. So in John chapter 19, John 19, 26 through 27, it says, when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." And then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And from that hour, the disciple took her to his own home. And I know some of the songs that we sing will say, "Woman, behold your son," as in, "Look at me, Jesus." I don't think that's what's going on here. If we look at this, in specifically verse 27, he is saying, take care of my mother when I'm dead. And that's what this disciple did. The same one that's being singled out. And we could add to this list that he was a first witness to the empty tomb. He ran with Peter, and we have the interesting detail. He makes sure to write that he beat Peter to the tomb, which I always think is funny. He also is singled out among the disciples at the end of the book in chapter 21, where people are asking, well, what's going to happen to this guy? And Jesus says, don't worry about him. But throughout this book, this disciple is being put out, and we can see that that's because there's a different relationship. That Jesus very possibly had a best friend. And that might be odd to think of at first, but it makes sense. If he is to be like us in every respect, he needed that one person that he could count on no matter what. And we all need that. And for those of us who are married, we can find that in our spouse, or maybe if you're like me, you have different persons for different things. I have my wife, and I also have some other very close friends that I maybe rely on for particular things. And life can be really hard if we don't have someone to share it with, right? And you don't need to be married to have that. But let me be very clear, I'm talking about platonic friendships here. Close platonic friendships. You don't need to be married to have that companionship, that close relationship, like we see with Jesus and the disciple that he loved. And so we can see this model in Jesus, how it moves from community to a circle of friends, to very close friends, to even possibly a best friend. And hopefully we're coming to understand the importance of it in our own needs. That if Jesus needed that, and that's how he did it, that's probably how I should do it too. Because if he needed it, then I certainly need it. And I think we can see this elsewhere in Scripture. For instance, I think we can possibly see this in the life of the Apostle Paul. If you look at Paul's life, he had a community of disciples around him. And I looked, for instance, just at Romans chapter 16, which I won't put on the screen. But if you want to turn there and look at this list of names, and he refers to all these people and says, my beloved so-and-so, so many times. And I went through and counted them, and there are 34 people in this list. And there's so many others mentioned in the New Testament. Paul had a community of disciples around him. And we also see in Paul's life that there was an inner circle. And you could probably add or subtract from this list maybe. But if you look at the book of Acts and what Paul says in particular in the epistles, Barnabas and Silas and certainly Timothy were especially close to him. If you look at the references to them, you can see that it was also possible with Titus and maybe Luke, and you might have different ones, but the point is that Paul had very close friendships and possibly even best friends, whoever you want to pick on this list. And I would surmise that maybe that was one of the reasons that his ministry was as successful as it was. Because he had people that he could count on and rely on, and that would help him and give him support because of the relationships that he had. And we can tell from the epistles, I'll say, that Paul was probably not the easiest guy to always get along with. But they were still intentional about their relationships. And I think that was one of the reasons that he was so successful as an apostle. So as we think about this, I hope you see that this is really practical. This is a clear example from Jesus' life of something that we can put into practice ourselves. This is an ideal or a guidance that we can work toward. And again, I don't think the particular numbers matter as much as the point. That we need to have a community, we need to have friends, we need to have close people that we can rely on, and that we probably need to have one person above all else that we can count on. So I'm not sure if you've ever considered this concept of Jesus' social circles before. I hadn't really before I had heard it. But his life is so helpful to us as an example, even down to guidance about the kind of relationships that we need. And who would have ever thought that that would be there in God's wisdom? But this model gives us a good picture about the kind of community and support that we should intentionally try to cultivate in our own lives. And this is something that all of us can do. To work at investing in building and creating new relationships. And it's relatively easy to remember this model, I think, from Jesus' life. So if you think about it, of going bigger to smaller, you get the disciples, then the 12, then the 3, and then maybe the 1. And that's easy to remember. That's how I remember it, at least. The disciples, the 12, the 3. And so let's use the example of Jesus to become more of what he wants us to be. If we're healthier, if we're following his example, then I think we can do his will better. And really, isn't that the whole point? So tonight we've been talking about belonging and community and support. And again, as I saw this morning, I recognize everybody here, I believe. But maybe you feel like you don't belong anywhere. Or maybe you know someone who feels like they don't belong anywhere. And as somebody who can say that they've experienced that too, I want to say that you will find what you're looking for in God's family. You'll find what you need there. And so if you're looking for purpose and belonging, Jesus can provide that through you based on what he has already done on your behalf. If you're looking for more, then please come talk to me or talk to someone else that you might know here. Or if you know someone that needs to talk, then pass them along if you're not willing to do it. But talk to someone if you're looking for more. And you have a convenient opportunity to do that now. Just come sit on the front row as Andrew leads us in this song.